Hey, deadly listeners, welcome to the Entrepreneur podcast again, a show that helps you gain a better understanding of Indigenous entrepreneurship and answer all your related questions. I'm your host, Dean Foley, an Indigenous entrepreneur with over 5 years' experience in the field. In today's episode, we'll hear from me, Lucky You, about Indigenous entrepreneurship versus Western entrepreneurship and what are the differences, which I spoke about at the First Nations Economic Forum. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining First Nations Economic Forum. Random event, put together just to create a platform for Indigenous people in Australia, and hopefully, we get more on board around the world to speak about, what they're doing in the Indigenous space for the economy, and what are the challenges and opportunities to take things to the next level and create opportunities that benefit community instead of benefiting just a select few like Western economies generally do. So welcome to United Nations Indigenous People, the World's Indigenous People Day. They keep on changing these names, but it's good to have on board and have a yarn about some of the differences between Indigenous and Western entrepreneurship. And excuse me for any ums and buts. My brain's a bit fried from, putting this event all together and getting the live speakers and uploading the videos and all that kind of stuff. So I'm a bit out of it at the moment, but I've got a massive coffee ready to go. So I should be good for this session and the rest of the day. Indigenous versus Western entrepreneurship. I think a lot of people who've already spoken have mentioned the different paradigms or worldviews of Indigenous people compared to Western people, generally speaking, and it shouldn't really be rocket science. I mean, it makes logical sense, just as there are differences between China's way of doing things and the US way of doing things, or Britain way of doing things. So you've got that Eastern versus Western viewpoints too, and there's different cultures and worldviews. So I mean, it shouldn't really shock anybody that Indigenous people think and their communities do things differently traditionally compared to Western societies. So there's a lot of differences, again, touching on, I think a few people mentioned individualism, egotistic, individual point of view in Western societies. It's generally about us, myself kind of thing. And in Eastern societies, generally speaking, Asian societies, it's all about the family, and they'll do anything for the family per se. And Indigenous, same, like there's family is very important, but for me and from what I've seen in most Indigenous communities, obviously not everybody's the same, but community trumps everything, and we shouldn't be, in theory, doing anything to progress our own interests or family interests above the best interests of community as a whole. So who am I? Grew up with the Aboriginal community here in Gunda, Kamilaroi man, and after serving 5 years in the Royal Australian Air Force, mostly based in Canberra, which I'm glad I'm not in at the moment because I'd be freezing my backside off. But so 5 years, and a friend in the Defence Force dropped a book on my desk about entrepreneurship, read it, and coming from poor family upbringing and growing up within the Aboriginal community, you don't see those opportunities. So it's kind of a, you see all these sports stars come in and that kind of stuff, but you don't hear about successful Indigenous businesses, entrepreneurship, and that kind of stuff. So it was a light bulb moment for me, and I wanted to learn more about entrepreneurship and how to run and grow businesses. So I left the Defence Force, moved up to Brisbane, to learn, begin that journey. And during that time, working part-time and all that kind of stuff to pay the bills, have a roof over the head, started studying postgraduate degree at university, and also started getting involved with the startup community in Brisbane. and finding out that there was, I guess, services available for Indigenous people, and going to those, mostly governments at the time. There was mostly just government providing services. And I thought the government was pretty hopeless, to be honest. No offense to most public servants, but yeah, it was just a bit of a shit fight. Lots of politics and people that I didn't really know about entrepreneurship, and didn't really. I felt, probably disconnected from the issues in community, kind of living in their ivory towers. So yeah, I was a bit disappointed with that. But I got invited to Australia's Health Startup Weekend, which was through, memory, ILAC, I think it was. It was the innovation arm of the University of Queensland at the time. Don't know if it still exists, but yeah, went to that. Thought it was pretty cool. Startup Weekend, Australia's Health Startup Weekend, and I think we finished third or something at that event. But thought it was pretty cool, and I thought, why not? Why hasn't there been an Indigenous version of this, just to promote Indigenous entrepreneurship? So with no event experience, within a couple months, able to raise tens of thousands of dollars to put the event together, and I think we had over. I think I capped it at 120 participants, and we had around 80, 100 participants during the 3-day event. So I did that. I knew there needed to be more done from my own experience, and just started reaching out to accelerator programs across Australia. And one of them got back to me, Slingshot, and they saw the value from a corporate social responsibility point of view. So yeah, got together with them, learned how to run accelerator content and all that kind of stuff. And they helped me run the world's first Indigenous business accelerator end of 2016. I think there's around about 5 Indigenous entrepreneurs at the time. But yeah, long story short, just this journey that, I just fell into, kind of thing, to start Barayamal, which is, now known as a world leader in Indigenous entrepreneurship, despite our small budget, competing against the big, well-funded government organizations. But it wasn't something that I wanted to do. I obviously want to help community, but I wanted to learn how to run and grow businesses, and I just fell into it, and if I didn't do it, who would, kind of thing. So we've done a whole lot of cool stuff, from the first Indigenous Business Accelerator, first hackathon, where we had I think it was 3 or 5 Indigenous charities come to Brisbane, and with the tech ecosystem there, try to build tech-based solutions to increase their impact. And we even did launch the first Indigenous themed Kodo Dojo, which Kodo Dojo is massive around the world. So Indigenous entrepreneurship is not something new. We haven't just reinvented this. It's been happening for a long time before colonisation, and there's a few examples here of some of the very innovative stuff. You get the I call them the anti-Indigenous rights groups or activists, who always bring in Indigenous people down and label them as barbarous and, caveman kind of thing. But Indigenous innovation here. So we've got Bunj Bin, excuse me for pronunciation, but it's the oldest agriculture site in the world, which farmed eels and fish. And from memory, that was around about 7,000 years old, and the oldest agriculture structure in the world, which is quite impressive. We didn't just invent boomerangs in Australia, despite what some of the anti-Indigenous people other people to think. Baking too, archaeologists have dug up sites and found tools that they believe, were tens of thousands of years old and used for baking, cooking bread, and that kind of stuff. There's a lot in there. It's been around for a while, as you can see in this diagram. It's nothing new, despite the imperialism propaganda to make all Indigenous people look like, cannibals and, cavemen that didn't really do anything for a long time, they were here. So Indigenous versus Western entrepreneurship. Again, it's been a long day, but the reason I had this presentation, I guess, was to dig in because, the government promotes that they're doing a lot of stuff, and Indigenous led and Indigenous communities are getting a lot of money and all this kind of stuff. But when you actually dig into it, the government and their benefits and where the money's actually going, a lot of that doesn't actually reach grassroots in communities or at First Nations to make a difference. And that's why you can hear all this stuff that's going on, but when you actually go out to Aboriginal communities, you can see they're still living in poverty. There might be one or two that have made it, but most of them are missing out still on those opportunities and all that money that's supposed to be going into community. And where is it going? It's going to the middleman. It's going to joint ventures that profit majority in non-Indigenous partners. It's going to government organizations, and who knows, what they do with it. So yeah, I thought it was important to mention because there's been a lot of money put towards Western entrepreneurship in Western ways of doing things.
Here's what I found.
And it'll be good for, see, even Siri's onto it now. It'll be good for, to, step back and revise the way of doing things, which may or may not be benefiting most people in the world. I think, most people live in poverty. So, how do we reinvent a new way of doing things that benefit most people? And obviously the Indigenous collective point of view has been operating for thousands, tens of thousands of years, and there's no need to reinvent the wheel per se. There's a good system, entrepreneurship system, Indigenous entrepreneurship already exists, and I think it's worth looking at to bankroll Indigenous entrepreneurship instead of sticking to status quo and supporting Western entrepreneurship, whether it's Indigenous or non-Indigenous people operating a Western style business. So that's what I see happening lots, in the entrepreneurship space, in the economy space for First Nations. You get all these Indigenous procurement policies, Indigenous contracts. Oh, look at these $1 billion, of government money. Where's it going? It's going to Indigenous people. Well, not really. It's going to these middlemen and entities. I put the church there because I was nothing against the church per se, even though obviously they haven't got the best history with Indigenous people, but just to symbolize a business entity. But you have these quote unquote Indigenous businesses, whether it's 5%, 51%, or 100% Indigenous owned, and it doesn't really matter because most of the money that's going through it's been siphoned into the non-Indigenous pockets and making the same people rich or richer, making them more money. And again, it's not going back into community. It's going back to the individuals, which is very Western way of doing things. And don't get me wrong, obviously, Indigenous entrepreneurship, it's not communism and that kind of stuff. People should be rewarded in community. Everybody's got value to add in their different ways, and they should be rewarded for their contribution to community, but they shouldn't benefit entirely over community. They shouldn't benefit off community, but they should benefit for their contribution to community. So I've got nothing against people who are doing good work to be rewarded to a certain degree, but yeah, if it's not flowing into community, what's the point of these quote unquote Indigenous procurement policy and all that kind of stuff when it should just be a Western procurement policy and just cut the Indigenous name out because it's kind of false advertising. in my point of view. Anyway, so yeah, Indigenous versus Western entrepreneurship. There's a lot of studies in growing studies, or correction, there's a lot of studies, I guess, around Indigenous culture and some of the differences between Indigenous Western cultures, throughout the world. And there are, not everybody gets along, but there are common, commonalities and common goals of Indigenous people, generally speaking. So yeah, you've got the Indigenous way of doing things, and then you got mainstream Western way of doing things, which is very focused on individuals. Even in Australia, even though it's very democratic and all that kind of stuff, if you look at the wealth, especially during COVID, the top 5-10% or whatever became 100 times wealthier during COVID, where the middle class and everybody else became poorer during COVID. So it's a system. It's like a pyramid scheme, and if you're at the top, you're laughing, but everybody else down below, is screaming like, what the hell's going on? And Indigenous way of doing things, it's more community focus, that have that worldview, that everything and everyone per se can add value and contribute to community, not just a select few who are being gifted, by the gods to save everybody. But that developed a lot of resources around Indigenous and Western entrepreneurship based on existing studies, academic studies already out there, and my own experience, and also reaching out to community too, like reaching out to community and getting their feedback from different people. Like, obviously can't reach everybody, especially in remote areas, but I try and do the best I can, with that community outreach, to reach as many people as possible. The people with the appropriate experience too, because nobody's good at everything. You need the right people to contribute to, and created a whole bunch of resources anyways. And again, just to finish off, Indigenous versus Western entrepreneurship, it's been happening for ages, thousands of years, to those anti-Indigenous rights groups. We haven't just invented the boomerang, we've invented a lot of cool stuff, and we will continue to create a lot of cool stuff in our own way, especially if we start getting opportunities. I'm going to speak about more of the finance side after lunch because I need a break. But Indigenous people obviously have been left out during this heightened imperialism era over the last couple of 100 years, and we need those opportunities, access to finance. We need the banks to start profiting off Indigenous land, stolen Indigenous land, and start giving us money so we can build our economies, our communities in a culturally appropriate way, that's sustainable. Obviously, we'll give the money back. It's not a handout, but we need all these organizations to stop talking about reconciliation, getting together, holding each other's hands, and start actually taking action, reconciliation. Start working with us, to create a better world and stop leaving us behind. It's good that United Nations has a day to celebrate, International Day to celebrate the world's Indigenous population, but at the same time, if they're just talking about decolonizing, in 10 years and all this other stuff, or climate change finance, Indigenous people only get 1% of the finance, and they're protecting, conserving 80% of rainforest biodiversity from the little land that they still have. I think, Indigenous people should be awarded financially too from their way of doing things. I mean, if Elon, you hear Elon having a whinge all the time about these other electronic car companies getting stuff, and he likes to claim that he basically invented the movement and all that kind of stuff, and maybe he did, And he has a fair point. You know, if he's doing most of the work in innovating, then he should get rewarded, because that's how it should be. But Indigenous people, with their conservation and looking after the environment and the way of doing things, aren't, you know, getting rewarded in this system. Even on the United Nations world platform, we're not being rewarded with the finance that's been committed to climate change and all that kind of stuff. And it needs to change. And that's basically the message anyways. Let's stop forcing Indigenous people, assimilating them to the Western way of doing things. Let's get back to supporting Indigenous entrepreneurship and bankrolling Indigenous entrepreneurship to create better communities and First Nations economies. All right, thanks everybody. Yeah, I'm going to dig into that coffee now, and we've got some awesome live speakers coming up soon. So stay tuned. Obviously, you don't have to spend the whole day on Zoom. Just check out the schedule, what's on, and that kind of stuff, and jump in and check out what's relevant to you and what you actually want to see Indigenous people talk about and that kind of stuff. As I mentioned, I've been busy with a whole bunch of other things, so unfortunately haven't got as many speakers as I want, and haven't been able to reach out on the global stage to get more international speakers, more Indigenous people from around the world. So that was a bit of a bummer, but version 1.0 normally sucks. Next year we'll take things to the next level. Also, if you've I keep sending out information and my inbox keeps getting filled with people commenting, but if you're on the LinkedIn event page, they get spammed with phishing scams and just spam, generally speaking, and there's nothing I can do. I tried to delete all the comments or the dodgy links to the dodgy websites that they're promoting to. I reported it to LinkedIn like 100 times. That's a LinkedIn Microsoft problem. There's nothing I can do about the LinkedIn event chat and all those dodgy articles and phishing scams and links that have been put into it. So yeah, if you haven't got the message already, hopefully you've got it now, and don't click on those links, and obviously don't give dodgy sites your bank details and all that kind of stuff. Just try and be a bit more cyber aware and watch out for those people with Western entrepreneurship opportunists trying to take your money and scam you. All right, thanks everybody. Peace.